Imagine a world where Africa's greatest empires, the powerful Mali, the skillful Ashanti, the resilient Zulu, and many others, didn't face European forces separately. Instead, they joined together, creating an unstoppable alliance. What if African kingdoms had united, pooling their strength to resist colonization, altering not only Africa's destiny, but the entire course of world history? How would a united Africa have reshaped the world we know today? Chapter 1. Building Military Power and Resistance. Let's start with the military. Picture Africa's strongest warriors from different regions standing side by side. Each kingdom had its unique warfare techniques. The Zulu, for instance, were renowned for their disciplined formations and agility in battle. If all these strategies had combined into a single, united African force, European armies would have faced unexpected challenges. European forces often succeeded by exploiting rivalries between kingdoms, pitting tribes and empires against each other. But an alliance? That would have forced the Europeans to confront a larger, more resilient, and well-coordinated defense. The scale of organized resistance would have made Africa one of the most challenging continents to colonize. European armies, typically reliant on superior technology and tactics, would have underestimated the resolve and unity of a combined African front. A unified military strategy could have leveraged guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and local knowledge of the terrain, further complicating European plans. Chapter 2. Strengthening African Trade and Economy. Next, let's consider the economy. At the time, Africa was rich in resources like gold, ivory, spices, and later, precious minerals. Without unity, many African kingdoms traded these resources with Europeans, often unwittingly fueling the very forces that would later turn on them. In a united Africa, trade agreements could have been more strategic, safeguarding African resources from exploitation. Imagine if united kingdoms formed an economic blockade, limiting Europe's access to essential goods. This would have had profound effects. Without African resources, Europe's industrial revolution might have struggled. African kingdoms could have traded selectively, choosing partners that benefited their economy while preserving resources. This move alone would have weakened Europe's growing dominance and positioned Africa as a global economic power much earlier. Chapter 3. The end of the transatlantic slave trade. One of the most profound impacts would have been on the transatlantic slave trade. Many African kingdoms resisted the slave trade but struggled to fend off European forces alone. A unified Africa could have enforced stricter protections against the enslavement and trafficking of its people, dramatically reducing or even preventing the scale of this devastating trade. Consider how different Africa's history would look if millions of Africans hadn't been forcibly taken from their homeland. With fewer people lost to slavery, Africa would have retained much of its talent, culture, and strength, potentially accelerating its own development instead of fueling economies abroad. The societal structures that developed in response to colonization would have evolved differently, leading to a more empowered and self-sufficient continent. Chapter 4. Protection and Preservation of African Cultures and Languages. Let's discuss culture. European colonization didn't just change political boundaries, it erased and disrupted countless cultural traditions, languages, and belief systems. A united Africa would have created a foundation for cultural preservation. Different kingdoms, each with their unique languages and customs, could have safeguarded their identities while building a shared African pride. Imagine the vibrancy of a continent where hundreds of languages and traditional knowledge systems are preserved and passed down instead of lost to colonization. A united African front could have established schools, promoting literacy and education while protecting religious practices. This effort would have resulted in a continent rich in cultural diversity and heritage, strengthening the identity of its people. Chapter 5. Impact on Global Power Dynamics. If African kingdoms had formed a strong union, Europe's global power dynamics might look entirely different today. European nations built wealth and status largely through exploiting Africa's resources and people. Without that foothold, Europe's industrial and economic growth could have slowed, while Africa, with its vast resources, would likely rise as a dominant force on the global stage. An economically strong, unified Africa could have established trade alliances with Asia and the Middle East instead of Europe. This shift in trade dynamics would have empowered African nations, allowing them to play a crucial role in global commerce. The world's history books would tell a vastly different story, with Africa and its rulers at the forefront of diplomacy and global influence. Chapter 6. How African unity could have shifted modern borders and conflicts. Now let's talk about Africa itself. Colonization left African nations with artificial borders, cutting across ethnic and cultural lines, leading to conflicts and instability that persist even today. However, a united African alliance could have shaped borders based on historical territories and mutual agreements. This unity would have resulted in far fewer internal conflicts and a stronger sense of community among different groups. A continent united by shared goals and values could mean fewer modern-day conflicts and a more peaceful Africa, working together to achieve common objectives instead of battling over arbitrarily drawn borders. Chapter 7. Legacy of African Unity and Inspiration for Future Generations. Imagine the legacy of such a united front, a history of pride, strength, and independence. Generations today would have grown up with role models from African empires that stood tall against European powers. An Africa with a shared legacy of resistance and unity could empower future generations to view their continent not as a place that was conquered, but as one that defied colonization and emerged stronger. This vision of unity would inspire not only Africans, but also people around the world, challenging the common narrative that resistance was impossible. Instead, it would illustrate a different path that history could have taken, where Africans took charge of their destiny. As we conclude, one question remains. How might our world today look different if African kingdoms had indeed united? Could this alternate history have led to a world where Africa was a leading global power with its own thriving culture and economy, untouched by foreign dominance? Think about how different our collective history would feel, with Africa standing as a symbol of unity and resistance. What do you think? How might this alliance have shaped our world in ways we can't even imagine? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective on how this "what if" could have altered history as we know it.